What's going on, y'all? I'm KM Best. Let's take a look at December's Spotlight caches. The first week of caches comes with absolutely no new cards. However, this is still a very interesting cache to take a look at. First up is Manthing for cost 5 power, and of course he has the ongoing ability to make 1, 2, and 3 cost cards at his location smaller. Man-Thing mostly doesn't see play right now. He's a reasonable card, but not one that is overwhelmingly powerful. And when your ability is just effectively stats, you tend to get in a competition with the best stats card at your cost, which is Darkhawk, which ends up being a little bit more valuable most of the time. So Man-Thing often ends up playing a sort of supporting role in Darkhawk decks, or he ends up playing a sort of primary role in his own deck. It's just that his own deck is sort of a debris type deck, and those decks aren't particularly good. Man-Thing is a fine card, but if you're using him in a normal Darkhawk deck, he is in competition with the biggest and best stuff at his cost, a competition that he mostly loses. If you use him in his own deck, that deck is not particularly overwhelmingly powerful. That said, it will be getting a couple extra tools later in the season. So right now, Man-Thing I think is not a super compelling reason to open caches, although I will say if you have an extra 3,000 tokens lying around, which I doubt most do, he's not the worst thing you can do with that 3,000 tokens. Take it from me, someone who picked up Martyr for a joke. Inasmuch as Man-Thing is fairly mediocre, Stegron is significantly worse. Man-Thing has legitimate uses. I won't be shocked if I see a Man-Thing in high-level competitive play. I won't be shocked if you play that card and I can actually lose to it. Stegron, I think I would be shocked if I saw this anywhere outside of Cerebro 5. And I think that is sort of worth pointing out. Like, this is the worst card in this box by a pretty decent margin. But it's not, like, totally unplayable. Like, I have seen people play Stegron. It's just surprising. I think the issue is that it is a card that does not move the needle in a positive direction when it comes to opening in this box. The way I look at Spotlight caches is from the perspective of someone who has none of the cards. And so if you have none of the cards in any of the Spotlight caches, you have to accept that, like, when you're opening one of these, you might end up getting something like Man-Thing and Stegron, and feeling pretty bad about yourself. And so for that reason, I tend to think that this Spotlight cache has a little bit of what I guess you would call pack filler in it. It's not that Man-Thing and Stegron are bad, it's just that they're not the reasons you're going to be opening this cache. Meet the reason that you're going to be opening this cache. Jeff the Baby Landshark is among the best cards in the entire game of Marvel Snap. When you are looking for a 2-cost card to put in your deck, he is a default option. Even in decks that are built around other 2-cost cards, Jeff somehow manages to find a way in. Now, he is in a worse state right now than he was about a month ago. Jeff, paired with Elsa, was so far and away the best 2-drop in the game that honestly, there was no real competition between Jeff and Elsa and literally everything else. So, now that Elsa has been nerfed and Werewolf by Night has taken over as the primary cheap stats card, Jeff doesn't have synergy with Werewolf by Night, and so he's actually seeing a lot less play than he normally would, which is to say, instead of being the most played and most common card in the game because he's in the best deck, he's now the most played and most common card in the game because he's in a variety of other decks that are not necessarily the best deck, but are still very good. And I think Jeff is the reason that this cache exists. Jeff is one of the best cards in the game, but I will say the fact that he is one of the best cards in the game should not blind you to the idea that other cards may be more advantageous to pick up at this time, depending on what you want to do. That said, it's very, very difficult to go wrong with Jeff. He is the card I am most comfortable saying is a good reason to open caches in the entire game. He's just great. You're gonna use him a lot. I have used him a ton. He is... A lot of people group him with Iron Lad, and frankly, he is significantly better. Like, Iron Lad's a very good card. Jeff is better. And I think of the currently existing Series 5 cards, Jeff is probably the one that you will use the most if you end up picking him up and you do not already own him. Now, this card comes out on the Season Pass during the week that the Spotlight caches are available with the cards that I just talked about in them, but I do feel like I should give some mention to Sebastian Shaw. this is a video focused mostly on the, spotlight caches, but I do want to say, the season pass, usually good value. If you are going to spend money in Marvel Snap, the season pass tends to be the best way to do it, as long as you're going to be able to get it up to level 50, but getting a card for that price of the season pass is usually pretty good, and historically, season pass cards have been pretty powerful as well. So, Sebastian Shaw. When I look at Sebastian Shaw, what I see is a potential second werewolf in some Surfer decks. I know there are currently Surfer decks built around werewolf that I like, and I wonder if this can be the backup for them. What I also see, though, is that he tends to want to go in a Surfer deck that is playing things like perhaps Nakia and Okoye, which means, unfortunately, that he'd want to go with Brood, which in turn means he might not actually go in Werewolf. So I have like two competing Surfer ideas that I want to try with this guy. I do think that ends up being the spot that he most likely will end up in for me. Surfer has a distinct lack of just like one big idiot. And I think, Werewolf helped that a lot. And now, of course, Shaw could help it too. It's just there's a point at which I do think Shaw is worse than Werewolf, but because of his ability to not require board space in the same way, he can go into different decks. So Werewolf by Night does not go into a Brood deck, Shaw can. And I guess at some point I wonder if the combination of Shaw plus Brood ends up being better than Werewolf in those Surfer decks. I don't actually know. It's an interesting conversation, but obviously Brood goes better with cards like Okoye and Nakia that buff the unit, and then of course the Broodlings alongside it, and Shaw wants those cards as well. So that is probably where I'm going to be starting with the guy. I don't have any a lot of ideas beyond that, because that's where I think he tends to go, but the real question is what that list ends up looking like, because Surfer lists can look very different from each other. And I do think that there's a world where I want to play him as second werewolf in a werewolf Surfer list. And then there's a world where I want to play him with no werewolf in a Brood Surfer list. And I'm not sure which one is going to end up being dominant, but those are the two trains of thought that I have for Sebastian Shaw. On the next Spotlight Cache, starting in the week of December 13th, we have Blob as the headlining new card. Blob is a 6/4, that's up from 6/3 in previous data mines, and he will be eating your entire deck and absorbing all of its power. In addition, he has an ongoing ability that says he can't be moved. A lot of people look at Blob and say, okay, I finally have a solution for the Darkhawk problem. And I think in Thanos, he can be a way to make your opponent's Darkhawk a lot smaller. That's definitely good. I think one of the things that strikes me, though, is the card Darkhawk itself, it's good, but the other cards that make up the Darkhawk package are what define a lot of how good its matchups are, right? Rockslide and Korg and Black Widow are still getting effective disruption off on you, even when the Darkhawk isn't going to be overwhelmingly large. And I think if you're a Thanos deck, my worry is you're so screwed when you miss a draw that you're going to end up in these situations where your deck just doesn't work. And it doesn't matter that you shrunk their Darkhawk with a Blob. Your deck just didn't do the thing that it wanted to do, because the Thanos deck playstyle tends to be stones on the first 3 turns, big guys on the last 3 turns. And if you aren't executing that playstyle, you're just playing big guys on the last 3 turns. I kind of think even a Darkhawk deck without a Darkhawk can still beat you. And I think that's a little bit worrying for me in terms of this guy. I also think that this guy is definitely not going to herald the return of Thanos, because the major issue that Thanos has right now isn't even Darkhawk, it is Loki. Loki is the major issue that Thanos has right now. Behind Loki, there is Killmonger. That's the second major issue that Thanos has right now. And that issue exists for pretty much the same reason. The first is Loki is an issue because your plan is to back up your stones with big guys, and Loki has a better early game than you, and then they play Loki, and they have your late game, and then you just end up kind of screwed. And the second one is that with Killmonger, again, your plan is stones on the first 3, big guys on the last 3, and you end up Killmongering, and the stones go away, and big guys on the last 3 is not going to win a game of Marvel Snap, unfortunately. So this guy, I don't know if he solves the problems for Thanos that people tend to think that he does. However, I do think that there's a world where this guy ends up really relevant. Like, if this, we've seen how strong just a big 6-drop can be before with high evolutionary Hulk. And if this guy gets into high evolutionary Hulk range where you can reasonably expect, 16 to 18 power out of him a lot of the time, that's actually just a really good card on its own. Like, not even really worrying about the rest of what he does. It's just a really good card on its own, enormously big. So I am interested to see how that ends up playing out, because I think if this guy does end up seeing play, the Darkhawk stuff, that's going to be a fringe benefit. He'll end up seeing play if he's just a really, really big guy as much of the time as possible. And I do think that's possible. I do want to know how he interacts with like ongoing abilities, because I think that's going to be pretty key to him. If, for example, you have, say, a null in your deck, will he get all the power of the null? I don't actually know. One other interaction that I think people are going to ask about is, does this count as destroying those cards or discarding them or anything like that? And I think the wording is specific enough that we can say, this is not going to pump your null up. This is probably not going to let you hella stuff. In a world where it does, that is an interaction to explore, but I am expecting that to not work. The Living Tribunal is actually like a fairly reasonable card in the sense that it is a card you can build a deck around and you will be able to get people with, and if they're not prepared for you, you will win a lot of games. However, with the presence of Alioth in the metagame, it has gone down in value pretty significantly, as the typical ways of Living Tribunaling are doing things like you either wave into Onslaught Iron Man Tribunal, or you do something like Hela Tribunal, which is like Invisible Woman MODOK Hela. And these are plays that completely eat it to Alioth. Like, the whole deck just cannot function in the context of that. The Invisible Woman play even eats it to, like, Cosmo. It's a very easily disruptible strategy, which means it's never going to be the best deck in the game, because as soon as it gets a target on its back, as soon as people start respecting it and teching for it, it becomes extremely easy to beat. Now, that said, it is a reasonable card to have in your collection if you just want to, like, one day be like, all right, I'm going to take this angle on the metagame. But I think that's a pretty small use case for most people. I think most people would be better suited getting more generally applicable cards than they would be picking up the Living Tribunal out of the Blob cache. Raona Ren Slayer mostly sees play right now in sort of these weird hybridized Darkhawk Mr. Negative decks, which I do think are probably the best way to play Mr. Negative if you're going to do that. So if you're interested in playing the best versions of Mr. Negative, I don't necessarily have an opposition to you picking up Raona Ren Slayer. I just think that she's not a very compelling reason for you to use your resources. She's in this sort of mid zone where you are going to have better uses for your resources at some point. That's kind of without question. And so if you use them on Raona and Blob and Living Tribunal, you better actually make sure you're going to use those cards. So ask yourself really, really carefully, are you going to use these cards? I think a lot about this box depends on how strong Blob is going to be. If Blob ends up being that big, enormous, awesome 6-drop that he could be, this could be a pretty exciting box. If Blob ends up being pretty mediocre, and it's hard for a 6-drop to be really good, it really is, I would avoid it. I think a lot of this box depends on Blob, because Raona and Living Tribunal are cool cards that boost off-meta fringe archetypes, but they're probably, because of that, not necessarily worth the expenditure. Next up is the week of December 20th, and this is Havoc. He highlights the spotlight caches this week, except he actually totally doesn't, because he is totally outshone by other cards in his cache. Now, Havoc has a very unique ability that is not necessarily easy to grasp on first glance. He's a 2/1 that says he will eat your extra energy at the end of the turn, but not your extra energy. He will eat one of your actual energy. What this means in practice is the turn you play him, you are capping your energy at what you have. If you play him on turn 2, you will gain an energy on turn 3, and at the end of turn 3, he will eat it. This will happen every turn. You will have 2 energy every turn if you play him on turn 2. This, to me, suggests that the only real way to play him is as a 2/9 on turn 5. That's how you want to be actually playing this guy. You could also, of course, play him as a 2/5 on turn 6. That's not, the end of the world. I think that probably works too. but you mostly want to be playing him on turn 5, on turn 6, which suggests that you want to put him in decks that are gonna go late. And what I mean by that is he could be a Sarah card as just a 2/5. It's like, all right, we'll play a 2/5 in our Sarah deck. It'll be fine. He could be the kind of card that would pair with like old Wave. You'd play like Havoc Wave and then like Doctor Doom the next turn. That would be pretty sick. And you could still do stuff like that with current Wave. It's just not as good because you're not restricting your opponent. I don't exactly know what you're supposed to do with this guy, because in my head, I think two conflicting thoughts. The first is, oh my god, I never want to play him. That seems awful. What are they thinking? And the second is, 2/9 is really, really big. Like, I do kind of wonder if the numbers on this guy aren't just big enough to make him, like, actually a pretty good card. But at the same time, it's like, I really wonder how big those numbers have to be in order to sacrifice, like, a whole energy on the most important turn of the game, turn 6. So I'm interested to see how this guy ends up shaping out, because I really, of all the cards here, I think I understand what most of them do and what they'll end up looking like. This guy, I don't get. And he is very unique. He is very exciting. And interestingly enough, because of the other contents of his box, I think we might end up seeing a lot of Havocs running around, at least on day 1, when people are looking to experiment with him, because a lot of people are going to end up with him because they were going for the other cards in his box. Nikomu is one of the best cards in the game currently. And I say currently because it's important to understand that that is a bit of a, temporal thing. Nikomu right now is so good because she is one of the best cards to play in your Werewolf by Night bounce shells. Now, if that changes and that is no longer the best thing to be doing in the game, she will end up having to find other roles for herself. That said, she is so flexible that I don't think that's going to be a huge problem. At the bare minimum, Nikomu goes in nearly every Thanos deck. At the bare minimum, Nikomu goes in basically every Destroy deck. That is the bare minimum of her. Right now, we're seeing something close to, I think, her maximum, which is she's not only in Thanos and Destroy, but a bunch of decks that are trying to do bounce stuff, right? So we're in a meta game that is very, very beneficial to her. We can see almost everything she can do. We're getting a lot out of her. I don't think she'll always be this good, but I do think, again, bare minimum, she's in Thanos, she's in Destroy, basically forever. This is a card that will be around for a very long time if you're even remotely interested in those archetypes. And the only reason I'm being so cagey about this is because I don't know what they're going to do balance change-wise. And I think that the decks that play her currently, the bounce stuff, the Loki stuff, those are balance outliers, and I would not be shocked to see that change. That said, I don't know if a change in context will make her bad, because, again, her floor is so high. She's always going to be played in Destroy. She's always going to be played in Thanos. That's her floor. And her ceiling is what we're seeing right now, where it's like you just need her to play the best decks in the game all the time. So I do think Nikomu is an extremely powerful card. Legion is a pretty solid card and tends to sort of scale with how embarrassing it is to play a 5/7. When Legion first came out, there were several decks that were very good at using early stuff to scale, such that you could use your 5-cost slot on some tech. And these decks, like Brood, Abs, you would just go like Forge into Brood into Absorbing Man. You'd have a million points on the board, and then it would be like, all right, well, I want to play some tech. That's Legion, right? You do the same thing in your bounce deck, or not your bounce decks, your move, small move decks. Those decks are pretty much dead now, but you would do the same thing. You had the same need for Legion. That said, I do think that Legion is a little worse than people tend to give him credit for. They look at him and they're like, well, that's the best card, and that's so good, it's amazing. And it's like, yeah, he's a really good card, but the more embarrassing it is to play a 5/7, the worse he gets. And there are definitely metagames, and we are currently in one, and we have been in one for a while, where it's pretty embarrassing to play a 5/7. And I do think that, that is a awkward spot to be in, right? The last time I was seriously playing a lot of this guy was in the original Loki meta, where I had to choose a threat at the 5-cost slot that I wouldn't be overwhelmingly upset my opponent got. And that's, like, it's not a very complimentary thing to Legion when you think about it, right? Like, it's like, okay, I'm going to play this Legion just so that if they Loki me, I don't have to be too mad about it. If they Loki'd a dinosaur, I'd be furious. And like that's sort of like the Legion thing, right? He's a good card, but I don't know if he's actually a great card. He's good, he's fine, he will win you games. The smarter you are, the better you are at using him, the more games he will win you. He's a good card. But because he costs 5, and because he has 7 power, there are going to be games where he is just fundamentally embarrassing. And those games, I think, they don't outbalance the amount of games where he's just like the only card that will ever win you the game from that spot. But the more of those games there are, the less playable he tends to be. I tend to think Legion is sort of a bellwether for healthy mid-range decks, which is to say, when a Legion mid-range deck is playable, it means the metagame is relatively balanced and there's nothing doing anything, completely overwhelmingly powerful, nothing out of whack. And when a Legion mid-range deck isn't playable, I tend to think that there's usually a reason for that. There is a deck that is causing that. And yeah, that is currently the case. That said, I do wonder if maybe he's a little too fair. I don't exactly know. I like him a lot, but again, like I'm a good player. Yeah, asterisk, I guess. I don't want to be arrogant. People get mad at me for being arrogant, but like I'm a good player, and I find a lot more value in him than I think other people do because of that. So if you're looking for a card to carry you, I don't think he's that. The final card in the month of December is Seline, a 1/1 with an on reveal ability that afflicts the lowest power card in each player's hand with -3 power. This is a bit of a weirdly timed card because it's a card that I think would go in the Annihilus style bounce decks. Like I've been playing a couple Annihilus bounce decks. This card seems great for me, but I wonder if it's good enough, if that makes any sense, right? Which is to say, I have no problem seeing how I would use this, which is I would want to give the hood -6 and send it over to my opponent. That makes perfect sense to me. I get it. Is her disruption of my opponent going to be relevant? And I think that's the more viable question here. I can understand how I would turn the fact that she's giving my card with the lowest power negative power into an advantage. I totally get that. I'd play it in an Annihilus deck. It makes perfect sense. What I need to know with this card is how much she's hurting my opponent outside of that scenario. Because if she is like a Spider-Ham or Iceman level disruptive piece to your opponent, while also allowing you to Annihilus more stuff over to them, I think she could actually be really good. The question is, I don't know if she's as good as those cards at disrupting your opponent. Because lowest power card is like it's a weird contextual bit of text, right? Where it'll be very different depending on the circumstances of each game you play her in. And it's a little bit hard for me to grasp how often that will be actually disrupting them and how often that will be a card they don't care about because they're going to play Loki and get rid of it, or because they're going to bounce it, or because they're going to destroy it, or because they just simply aren't going to play it because they have other options that are now better. And I just don't know exactly how disruptive she's going to be, and I think a lot of her power is going to key off of that, because I totally want to play her in the one where it affects me and I turn that into an upside. I get it. That's awesome. I want to do that. How much it impacts our opponents is going to be the real question with this card, I think. There are 4 cards in caches this month that I consider just like absolute slam dunks, where people are like, should I get this? The answer is usually going to be yes. And they are, of course, Jeff, Nico Minoru, Legion, and this is the 4th, Iron Lad. Now, if I had to rank them, I would say Jeff is 1, Lad and Nico are either 2 or 3, and Legion is 4. So that should inform your priority here. I would say Lad could either be 2 or 3, depending on how you value Nico, because I do think we're in a metagame that is very, very pro Nico and not necessarily so pro Lad, but fundamentally, they're like seem to occupy the same space to me in my head. This metagame's also actually relatively anti-Jeff compared to other metagames previously, but that shouldn't stop you. Iron Lad is a staple card in every Darkhawk deck for the most part outside of the bounce ones, and a very, very good card in a surprising variety of archetypes. Good stats, great effect. There's not a lot to talk about with Iron Lad. He's just very, very good. He's a very good card. And I do think that there are going to be people who are like, should I open this cache for Iron Lad? And it's like, maybe. If that is what you've been saving up for, I mean, I know there are people who've been saving up for an Iron Lad cache. This is actually a pretty interesting month in terms of like real staples coming out. I would say this is either the second or third most important card to pick up of the entire month. Black Knight decks are fine, but a little bit clunky and a lot bit vulnerable to tech. So if you're investing in your big 420 discarded the Infinite guy, you get your Ghost Rider, you get all that. The issue is most of the time you're going to end up having to play one of those onto the board before turn 6. And because of that, especially, you know, the Black Knight Sword is very vulnerable to the card Shadow King. And of course, playing any big guy early is very vulnerable to Shang-Chi. I don't think that means the deck is like ultimately terrible. It's just not very well positioned right now because there's a ton of Shadow King running around. There's a ton of Shang-Chi running around. It's the kind of deck that can only exist in certain metas. And I would actually draw a comparison to Living Tribunal. Like, this is a fine card to pick up if you're like, I want to attack the metagame from this angle for like a day and a half. But it's probably not a card you need to prioritize if you're just looking to play the best decks consistently, because it is the kind of deck that once people start even recognizing it and being like, oh, I know what to do here, it gets a lot worse. And it is also the kind of deck where once people start actually packing hate for it, and it's never been good enough for people to pack hate for it, right? Like, this is a deck that takes, like, this deck takes hits just from other decks existing and people playing tech cards to beat them that also beat Black Knight. And so I think that that is sort of the major issue that it has, which is like, it's a fine, reasonable, you can play it. I'm not going to get mad at you. It's just probably never going to be the best deck. And when you're investing in cards at this price point, you probably want them to have the capability of being the best deck. That's just my read on it. I don't know exactly what the future holds. If anything comes out for Black Knight, I truly don't know. I'd love to see it. But that is the last bit of cards for this month. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump on my soapbox for just a second, because I want to talk about something that happened to me and something that I'm seeing a lot in the Marvel Snap community with regards to data mined cards. When I last did this video, I was using data mines. As far as I know, the resources that I'm still using for this video are data mined. And that means that these are subject to change. And I want to be super, super clear about that, though. What does data mining actually mean? It means someone looks at the code of Marvel Snap and it sees this information in there, and then they tell that to us. Now, that does not mean that this is a promise. I see a lot of people getting really mad, like the Bast bundle was data mined at $5 and was released at $20, and it's like, why would they do this? They must hate low-paying players. And it's like, no, they probably just did that and then didn't put it in the original thing that was data mined. They probably just did that closer to the deadline because that's how jobs work, right? When I had a real job, a lot of my work was turned in when it was due and not before then. So I think there's like this idea that data mines are promises, and they're not. And I just wanted to address that really quickly. Like, I do expect these to be what the cards in the caches actually are. If any of them change, I'll note it in the description of the video. And like my previous video, the reason I'm doing this video is because they changed. And it's like, all right, look, if we're going to take the upsides of a game where changes are constant, a constantly moving meta, changes and balance patches like every other week, if we're going to take the upsides of that, sometimes there's going to be downsides to that, which is data mines are not going to be 100% accurate. And of course, Second Dinner's official policy on data mines is they simply do not exist. So there's no point in me going like, hey, Glenn, can you tell me about this? Because for whatever reason, I don't actually know. But like, their official position is they're not real. And I have no idea why that is their official position. But I hope that we can maintain this state of where their position is they're not real, and we can still use them and look ahead and plan ahead. Because honestly, I think this stuff is helpful for people. I think being able to plan ahead is helpful for people. And I get that when it is disrupted, that is frustrating. But directing your frustration at the company that allows this practice to continue, I think, is perhaps maybe misguided. That's sort of where my head is at. So I wanted to put this on here so you understood this is data mined information and is absolutely subject to change. And I want you to know that. And I try to be as 100% transparent on this as possible because I think it's really important to do that. And I think maybe the fact that other people are not being clear about that is why there's so much anger when data mined information changes, because it gets seen as, oh, you were going to do this, and then you made it this, and this is worse. And it's like, you have no idea if they were going to do that in the first place. Those numbers could have been placeholders. I have no idea. Now, when the cards are actually announced, is when we can say, officially, that's what these were going to be. So, that's sort of where my head is at right now. I just wanted to get that off my chest. As always, thank you so much for making it this far in the video. I have been KM Best. I will see you in the next one.